4:47 a.m. Meridianville, Alabama. A cul-de-sac at the northern edge of Madison County. 12 houses, 1 streetlight, and a sky that hadn't decided yet between black and gray. Frost on the windshields. Temperature, 31 degrees Fahrenheit. 42 federal agents moved in 3 staggered columns through the pre-dawn dark. No sirens. No flashlights until the final 30 yards. U.S. Marshals on the stack. Homeland Security investigations flanking. Madison County Sheriff's deputies holding the perimeter. Every agent had been briefed on the floor plan. Every agent knew where the hallway was, where the rear rooms were, and what the thermal imaging had shown about those rooms. They had rehearsed the entry sequence at a staging facility 2 counties over, 3 times in the 48 hours before the operation, moving through a taped outline on a concrete floor that approximated the layout of the house. The house at the end of the cul-de-sac looked exactly like every other house on the block. Pressure-washed vinyl siding. A boat on a trailer in the driveway. A "Beware of Dog" sign zip-tied to the chain-link gate. Nobody in the neighborhood had ever heard that dog bark. Not once. The entry team reached the front door. They moved the last 30 yards without lights, navigating by the ambient gray of the pre-dawn sky and the single streetlight at the cul-de-sac's entrance, which cast long shadows across the frost-covered lawns. The lead agent on the stack had memorized the approach path on satellite imagery: 4 porch steps, a screen door that opened outward, a solid wood primary door with a deadbolt. The screen door had been propped open from the inside, which meant the occupants had either expected a delivery or had been careless. Neither possibility was comforting. The ram swung, and what they found on the other side of that door would require 7 federal agencies, 2 grand juries, and a sealed indictment out of Grainger County, Tennessee, to fully explain. It started none of those places. It started on a mail route with a woman who noticed that the takeout bags didn't add up. Here is what the neighbors did not know about the house at the end of the cul-de-sac. Nobody lived there. Not in any ordinary sense. The single pickup truck parked outside had not moved in 11 weeks. The curtains on every window were the same color, beige, and they never changed position. No recycling bin ever appeared at the curb. No Amazon boxes stacked by the door. The "Beware of Dog" sign was the only decoration. And every few days, usually around dinner time, a delivery driver would pull up and leave multiple large bags of takeout food at the front step. They were always claimed within 2 minutes. The door would open, a hand would reach out, and the door would close. The delivery logs would later become federal evidence. Between October 7, 2025 and January 14, 2026, the same address received food orders on 41 separate days. The average order total, $63.40. That is not the food bill of 1 person. That is not the food bill of 2 people. According to federal prosecutors, it was the food bill of closer to a dozen. 1 person noticed the math. Her name is not in any public document. The federal case file refers to her only as a cooperating civilian witness. She drove a Postal Service mail route through the northern stretches of Madison County, a route she had worked for 9 years. She knew which houses were occupied, which were seasonal, which were for sale, and which sat empty. She also noticed patterns in delivery traffic, the way someone who watches a street long enough begins to recognize its rhythms. After 9 years, a route becomes a body of knowledge. Which driveways get shoveled within an hour of snowfall? Which porches collect mail for days before anyone retrieves it? Which households receive packages on a predictable weekly cycle? The route is not just geography. It is a portrait of how people live, rendered in the small daily transactions of domestic existence. The house at the end of the cul-de-sac had a rhythm that was wrong. One truck, never occupied in any visible way. Curtains that didn't move. And yet, multiple times each week, large food deliveries. She started keeping an informal log in November 2025. Date, time, number of bags, approximate size of orders. She did not know what she was documenting. She only knew it felt wrong. She later told the postal inspector who received her log that she almost didn't write anything down at all. She thought she might be imagining a pattern that wasn't there. She kept writing anyway. By mid-November, she brought her log to her postmaster. The postmaster brought it to a postal inspector. And that is where the paper trail, unofficial as it was, entered a system designed to cross-reference anomalies. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. A mail carrier's handwritten log of takeout deliveries should not, by any conventional logic, trigger a multi-agency federal response. The Postal Inspection Service handles mail fraud, theft, commercial crimes. Not this. But the postal inspector who received the log in late November 2025 had a second piece of information that the mail carrier didn't know about. That address had appeared 6 weeks earlier in a database query run by the U.S. Marshals Service Fugitive Task Force for the Northern District of Alabama. The query was tied to a federal indictment out of Grainger County, Tennessee, a sealed grand jury return naming a network of individuals connected to a long-running criminal enterprise that had been operating across multiple states since at least the spring of 2025. The Grainger County indictment had flagged several residential addresses in northern Alabama as possible operational nodes. The house at the end of the cul-de-sac was one of 7 flagged addresses. It had been ranked 4th in priority. It was about to move to the top of the list. The postal inspector contacted the Marshals Task Force directly. 2 weeks of internal cross-referencing followed. The Marshals pulled utility records for the address. Power consumption for a supposedly vacant or single-occupancy house was running at 240% of the neighborhood average for that month. Water usage told a similar story. The garbage records showed 1 pickup every 2 weeks, exactly the minimum required by the county, and the weight logs from the automated trucks indicated consistently heavy loads. None of that proves a crime. All of it proves that the house was more occupied than it appeared. And when Homeland Security Investigations was brought into the coordination in December 2025, they added 1 more data point. A cell tower in the northeastern corner of the cul-de-sac had pinged 3 separate prepaid mobile phones at that address on a rotating basis over the previous 60 days. The phones never made calls. They transmitted data only. Brief, encrypted bursts, usually between midnight and 3 a.m. 3 burner phones. In a house with 1 truck. That the neighbors thought was empty. I spent time going through the documented timeline of this investigation, and one detail kept nagging at me. The address had been sitting in the Marshals database for 6 weeks before the postal inspector made contact. 6 weeks. The food deliveries were already happening. The burner phones were already active. The power draw was already elevated. At what point does a flagged address become a priority? The answer, in this case, was the mail carrier's log. Not a wiretap. Not a confidential informant. Not a sophisticated surveillance operation. A 9-year postal route employee writing down dates and bag counts in a personal notebook. What strikes us about this case is that the investigative infrastructure, the databases, the cross-referencing systems, the task forces, was already in place. What it needed to activate was the one observation that hadn't been automated. The human eye on an ordinary street. By late December 2025, The U.S. Marshals Task Force had elevated the address to primary status in the Grainger County sweep. HSI formally joined the investigative stack. A federal surveillance operation began in earnest. The surveillance lasted 22 days. What it confirmed and what it added would reshape the scope of the entire operation. The task force had gone in expecting to find a fugitive from the Grainger County indictment. What they found was something the indictment had not anticipated. But they didn't know that yet. Not on December 28th. Not on January 4th. Not until an agent assigned to a routine equipment check inside the mobile surveillance unit flagged something in the thermal imaging data. The mobile surveillance unit had been positioned on the street 3 houses north of the target address, presenting as a utility company vehicle. Standard equipment, standard markings. The kind of vehicle that becomes invisible to a residential street within 48 hours, simply because it looks like it belongs. The unit ran continuous thermal imaging on the target structure from a concealed aperture on the vehicle's rear panel. The imaging ran 24 hours a day. It produced a documented record of heat signatures inside the house across the full 22 days of the operation. The rear of the house, specifically what the floor plan registered as 2 back bedrooms, was generating a sustained heat signature inconsistent with normal residential occupancy. The temperature differential between those rooms and the rest of the house was notable even through the exterior wall. The rooms were warmer, consistently, and the signature was distributed in a pattern that the thermal analyst, in her written assessment, described as consistent with multiple individuals in a confined space. Multiple individuals. In rooms with no exterior windows. The assessment landed on the task force coordinator's desk on January 6, 2026. The coordinator read it twice. Then she pulled the floor plan for the house, obtained through county property records, and compared the thermal data against the architectural layout. The floor plan showed 2 bedrooms at the rear of the house, each with a standard window facing the backyard. The surveillance footage, 4 weeks of it, showed those windows boarded over from the inside. Curtains were visible from the exterior, but no light ever came through them. Not at any hour. The coordinator contacted HSI. Within 48 hours, the operation had shifted from a fugitive sweep to something considerably larger. The next obstacle was legal. Moving from a fugitive apprehension warrant to a broader search warrant required presenting the evidence in a specific sequence to a federal magistrate, and several elements of the surveillance evidence had been gathered under the original warrant's authority, which was scoped to the Grainger County fugitive matter. The task force's legal team spent 11 days drafting an affidavit that accurately characterized the scope of the evidence without overreaching the original authorization. 11 days of legal drafting while the thermal signatures continued appearing in the nightly reports. The warrant for the full search and entry was signed by a federal magistrate on January 17, 2026. It covered the entire premises, all persons present, all electronic devices, all firearms, and all evidence of any federal offense. The raid was scheduled for January 22nd. Pre-dawn. Maximum suppression of warning time. 42 personnel. On January 18th, 4 days before the scheduled entry, one of the 3 burner phones went dark. Stop transmitting. The task force coordinator convened an emergency assessment. Had the occupants been tipped? Was the operation compromised? Did someone on the inside know? The assessment lasted 6 hours. The conclusion: the phone had likely lost battery or been discarded as a routine security measure. The other 2 burner phones remained active. The thermal signatures in the rear rooms remained consistent. Power draw at the address had not changed. There was no indication of accelerated departure. Put yourself in the task force coordinator's shoes for a second. You have a signed warrant, 42 agents staged, a 22-day surveillance operation, and one of 3 phones goes silent 4 days before entry. You cannot know why. You have to decide, proceed on schedule, accelerate, or delay. She chose to accelerate by 3 days. January 19th was briefly considered. Then logistics moved the date to January 22nd. And then intelligence from a separate, unrelated Grainger County monitoring operation moved everything forward again. On the evening of January 21st, a vehicle associated with the Grainger County indictment, not the pickup truck at the cul-de-sac address, but a second vehicle whose plates had been in the task force database for weeks, was spotted at a gas station 11 miles from Meridianville. The timing was either coincidence or it wasn't. The task force coordinator made her call at 11:17 p.m. on January 21st. The entry was moved to 4:47 a.m. January 22nd, 2026. Before the columns formed in the pre-dawn dark of January 22nd, there was a final briefing in the parking lot of a church on the county road 3 miles east of the cul-de-sac. 42 agents in cold weather tactical gear, standing in the ambient glow of 2 vehicles' interior lights, going over the floor plan one final time. The task force coordinator stood at the front with a laminated diagram. She walked through the entry sequence, the designated positions for each team element, the locations of the 2 rifles observed through the curtain, and the additional weapons suspected behind the false panel, the locations of the electronic devices on the folding table, and the protocol for the rear room. That protocol was specific. The rear room was to be approached last in the entry sequence, after the front rooms were cleared and secured, and the entry was to be made by a designated sub-team accompanied by an on-scene medical responder who had been briefed on potential victim conditions. The medical responder was not a law enforcement officer. She was a registered nurse employed by a contracted medical response unit, and she had been embedded with the task force since January 18th, specifically for this contingency. The coordinator had requested her presence after reading the thermal analyst's report. The briefing ended at 4:19 a.m. The columns formed at 4:30. They moved in silence through the residential streets of the northern neighborhood, sidearms holstered, long guns slung, footfalls dampened by the frost-softened grass, where agents moved off the sidewalk to reduce sound. 11 minutes from the staging area to the target. Nobody spoke. 42 agents. 3 columns. A frozen cul-de-sac in Madison County. The stack reached the front door at 4:46 and 50 seconds. The agent on point observed a rifle leaning against the interior wall, visible through a narrow gap in the front curtain. He reported it to the tactical commander via radio. The commander had 17 seconds to confirm or abort. He confirmed. The ram swung at 4:47 a.m. exactly. The door failed on the first strike. 2 agents on point entered low. A third covered the hallway. The rifle observed through the curtain, a converted semi-automatic weapon, modified with an auto-sear to enable fully automatic fire, which made it a machine gun under federal law, was lying against the wall as reported. No one was holding it. The front room was empty of people. 1 folding table. A laptop, closed. 3 prepaid mobile phones, 2 active, 1 dark, matching the surveillance data. A shelf along the east wall holding ammunition, and a second converted rifle. The smell of takeout food. Paper bags stacked near a trash can. A hallway led toward the rear of the house. The tactical team moved down that hallway in under 40 seconds. At the end, a door. Interior-grade solid wood. A padlock on a hasp, mounted from the outside. The padlock was new. The hasp screws were new. Someone had installed them recently. The bolt cutters were already in the stack. The lock came off. The door opened. Federal case documents describe what the entry team found as follows: a rear space encompassing both original bedrooms with the dividing wall removed, approximately 480 square feet, a single overhead bulb, no windows, and 12 young women, ranging in age from 22 to 26 years old. All were alive. Each received immediate medical evaluation on scene. 4 were transported by ambulance to a regional medical facility for further assessment. The remaining 8 were evaluated by medical personnel staged at the perimeter and then transported to a secure location for initial processing by HSI victim advocates. They had been there for 41 days. 41 days in a sealed interior room with no natural light, no access to the outside, and 1 overhead bulb. Federal case documents use clinical language. That is the language of the court. The clinical language is conditions consistent with prolonged confinement. The clinical language does not need elaboration. What it communicates to anyone who reads it is sufficient. The registered nurse who entered the rear room as part of the designated sub-team was the first medical professional those 12 young women had seen in 41 days. Her incident report, filed with the Contracted Medical Response Unit and subsequently entered into the federal case record, described the space in terms of what it contained and what it lacked. It contained 12 sleeping pallets arranged along 3 walls, constructed from flattened cardboard boxes and folded moving blankets. It contained 4 plastic storage bins used as personal storage. It contained 2 portable toilets of the kind used at outdoor events, positioned in the far corner behind a curtain of hanging bed sheets. It contained a stack of prepaid debit meal cards in a Ziploc bag hung on a nail by the door, the cards used by the network's operators to load the delivery app accounts used for the food orders. It lacked ventilation beyond a single interior-grade vent in the ceiling that connected to the house's central air system and had been partially blocked with a folded towel. It lacked any form of clock or calendar. It lacked any communication device. The overhead bulb operated on a wall switch located outside the locked door, on the hallway side of the padlock hasp. The occupants of the room could not control their own light. The nurse's report does not editorialize. It describes. The description is enough. The 12 young women had been reported missing from 4 different states over a 6-week window in the fall of 2025. Their families had filed reports with local law enforcement agencies in their respective jurisdictions. Those reports had not, prior to the January 22nd raid, been linked to each other by any database or investigative cross-reference. They existed in separate systems, filed under separate case numbers, assigned to separate detectives in separate counties in separate states, each one a discrete entry in a missing persons database rather than a data point in a pattern. The connection between them was not their geography. It was the network. 3 of the 12 had last been seen within a 40-mile radius of a transit hub in a mid-Atlantic state. 2 others had disappeared from a college town in the Upper South. The remaining 7 came from 6 different cities in 3 additional states. Their ages clustered between 22 and 26. Their backgrounds were varied. Several had been students. 1 had been employed in the service industry. 2 had been between jobs at the time of their disappearance. What the case documents identify as the common factor connecting their initial contact with the network is described in a single line of the HSI Victim Services Intake Summary. Each was targeted through an online platform offering short-term employment or housing assistance. The platform was legitimate in its design and presentation. It operated as a real service with real listings, managed by real accounts that had posting histories extending back 18 months. The job and housing listings used as recruitment tools were embedded within a larger volume of genuine listings, making the fraudulent entries difficult to distinguish. HSI's digital forensics team, working backward from the devices recovered at the Meridianville house, identified the platform accounts used to contact victims within 12 days of the raid. Those accounts had been accessed from IP addresses routed through a virtual private network, and the VPN in question had been paid for through one of the layered financial accounts that the laptop's transaction records documented. The digital thread connecting the recruitment accounts to the financial architecture to the laptop on the folding table in the Meridianville cul-de-sac took 12 days to establish and was described by the HSI digital forensics supervisor as among the cleaner chains of digital evidence he had seen in a case of this type. Clean, in the sense of being traceable, in the sense that the operators had been careful but not careful enough, or careful in the ways they understood and careless in the ways they did not. The families of the 12 young women were notified through HSI victim advocates in coordination with local law enforcement in each jurisdiction. The notifications happened on January 22nd and 23rd. The case file does not describe those conversations. There are no transcripts. There is a single administrative notation in the victim services log for each family. Notification completed. Advocate assigned. That notation is everything and nothing. It marks a moment that no notation can adequately record. Here is what the entry team also found, in the rooms beyond the locked door and in the section of drywall that responded differently to a tactical knock. 6 additional converted rifles, mounted on a wooden rack that had been constructed behind a false panel in what was formerly a closet. The panel had been drywalled over and painted. It matched the rest of the wall in texture and color. A casual inspection would not have found it. The rack held 6 weapons. Together with the 2 in the front room, that brought the total to 8 converted semi-automatic rifles, each modified with an auto-sear to enable full automatic fire. Under federal statute, each conversion renders the weapon an unregistered machine gun. Possession of an unregistered machine gun carries a mandatory minimum of 10 years in federal prison per weapon. 8 weapons. 8 mandatory minimums. Potentially 80 years of exposure on the weapons charges alone before prosecutors even addressed the other elements of the case. A technical firearms examiner from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives arrived on scene at approximately 6:15 a.m. to assess and document the weapons. His preliminary written report, filed later that morning, noted that the auto-sear modifications on all 8 weapons were consistent in construction and tooling, meaning, in his professional assessment, they had been manufactured by the same person or persons, using the same equipment, likely in the same location. The modifications were not crude. They reflected a working knowledge of the weapon's internal mechanics. This was not improvised. This was production. That finding opened a second thread in the investigation. The Grainger County indictment had been focused on a network operating across northeastern Tennessee and northern Alabama. The indictment named individuals involved in the movement of persons across state lines and the operation of properties used as operational nodes. The weapons had not been anticipated. They suggested a supply-side element to the network that prosecutors had not fully mapped. The ATF examiner's report became the basis for a parallel investigative line that ran concurrent with the prosecution of the 3 individuals arrested at the scene. The tooling analysis was submitted to the ATF's National Tracing Center, where it was run against a database of known auto-sear manufacturing signatures developed over the previous decade from weapons recovered in unrelated federal cases across the southeastern United States. The comparison returned a partial match to tooling marks recovered from weapons seized in a separate investigation in a neighboring state approximately 7 months earlier. That earlier investigation had been closed without prosecution due to insufficient evidence connecting the weapons to any specific individual. It was reopened within 10 days of the Meridianville raid. Here's the take that'll probably get us some pushback. The 8 converted rifles were arguably the most significant find in that house from a prosecutorial standpoint, and they almost didn't make it into the initial warrant scope. The warrant had been drafted around the fugitive matter and the confinement evidence. The weapons were covered under the probable cause language for the broader search, but the ATF was not part of the original coordination. If the task force coordinator had not had the presence of mind to include ATF in the pre-dawn staging, a decision she made at 1 a.m. on January 22nd, based on the rifle observed through the curtain, the chain of custody on the weapons evidence could have been procedurally complicated. One rifle visible through a gap in a curtain. 17 seconds to decide. And the ATF examiner was on site. Most people assume these operations are choreographed months in advance down to the last detail. The evidence in this case tells a different story. The most critical preparation decisions were made in the hours before entry, under time pressure, by a coordinator working on 3 hours of sleep. And they were right. By 7 a.m. on January 22, 2026, the scene at the Meridianville cul-de-sac had expanded to include personnel from the U.S. Marshals, HSI, ATF, the Madison County Sheriff's Office, FBI Victim Services, and 2 contracted medical response units. The house itself was cordoned. The neighbors, emerging in the early morning light to find a federal operation filling their quiet street, stood at the perimeter tape and watched without fully understanding what had happened inside the house they had lived next to for months. 3 individuals were taken into custody at the scene. 2 were apprehended in the front rooms during the initial entry. A third was found in a utility closet in the hallway. No shots were fired. All 3 were transported to Madison County. All 3 were held without bond pending initial appearance on the federal charges. Federal prosecutors filed a criminal complaint that afternoon. The complaint named 3 defendants, referenced the Grainger County indictment as the investigative backbone, and listed the charges: possession of unregistered machine guns, conspiracy to transport persons across state lines for purposes of illegal commercial activity, and unlawful confinement. The complaint noted that additional charges were under consideration pending further investigation. The 3 individuals in custody were not, in the assessment of the investigating task force, the top of the network. This is a distinction that matters enormously in federal prosecution strategy, and it is one the public does not always appreciate. The people in the house, the ones who were there when the door came down, are, in prosecutorial language, the nodes. The operators. The people who managed a specific location in a larger system. They can be charged immediately, and they were. But the architects of the system, the people who financed it, who directed it, who moved resources into and out of multiple such locations across multiple states, those individuals were not in the cul-de-sac. The initial appearances for the 3 defendants were held the morning after the raid, January 23rd, before a federal magistrate in the Northern District of Alabama. Each defendant appeared without having entered into any cooperation agreement. Each was represented by court-appointed counsel, as all 3 had waived their right to privately retained representation at the initial hearing, a fact noted by federal prosecutors as consistent with a pattern seen in other network-adjacent prosecutions, where operators are instructed in advance not to cooperate and to expect that the organization's resources will be unavailable to them following arrest. Whether that instruction had been given in this case was, as of the first court appearance, unknown. The magistrate set detention hearings for each defendant individually. The government's detention memo filed that same morning argued that each defendant posed a risk of flight based on the structure of the network, the existence of unidentified co-conspirators outside the United States, and the documented use of false identities and anonymizing communication methods within the Grainger County network, as described in the indictment. The memo cited the $1.2 million transaction volume documented on the laptop as evidence of financial resources potentially available to the network even after the arrest of 3 of its members. The magistrate ordered detention without bond for all 3 pending their detention hearings. All 3 defendants were held without bond through the end of February 2026. None had entered a plea as of the most recent public court filing available. One had dismissed court-appointed counsel and filed a motion to represent himself, which was pending before the magistrate. Some of them were identified in the weeks that followed through evidence recovered at the scene. The 3 burner phones contained encrypted data. The laptop on the folding table, once forensically unlocked, contained financial transaction records and communication logs that federal investigators described as substantially expanding the known scope of the Grainger County network. The ATF's analysis of the converted rifles identified tooling marks consistent with a specific type of machining equipment. That equipment was subsequently traced, through purchase records, to a location in a different state. That question came up repeatedly in the internal review that followed the January 22nd operation. There is no clean answer. By February 2026, 2 additional individuals had been named in a superseding indictment, expanding the original Grainger County matter. Neither was in custody. One was believed to have left the United States prior to the January 22nd raid. The second individual's whereabouts were described by federal prosecutors in a court filing dated February 14th as unknown. Unknown. 4 weeks after the raid. With the full evidence package from the Meridianville house available to investigators, the financial records on the laptop told one part of the story. They showed inflows and outflows consistent with the operation of multiple properties over a period of at least 14 months. The total transaction volume documented in those records, according to a financial analyst summary filed in federal court, exceeded $1.2 million across the period covered. The destination of a significant portion of those funds, described in court documents as approximately $400,000 in outbound transfers, had not been traced as of the most recent court filing available. $400,000. Unrecovered. Moving through a layered transfer system that federal analysts were still mapping as of late February 2026. The layered transfer system, as described in a financial analyst declaration attached to the government's brief in support of the superseding indictment, used a combination of domestic accounts held in the names of entities with no apparent business operations, cryptocurrency conversions executed through a wallet address not linked to any identified individual, and a series of outbound wire transfers to correspondent banking accounts in jurisdictions with limited financial disclosure requirements. The transfers were structured to remain below reporting thresholds where possible. The forensic accountants working the case had, as of the February filing, reconstructed the path of approximately $800,000 of the $1.2 million in documented transactions. The remaining $400,000 had moved through a conversion point from which the analysts had not been able to trace the destination. That gap, $400,000, vanished into a cryptocurrency conversion executed sometime in late November 2025, represented a cold stop in an otherwise reconstructible record. One detail that stuck with me in reviewing the case documents, the mail carrier's handwritten log, which had started this entire chain, was entered into evidence as a federal exhibit. 9 weeks of dates, delivery times, and estimated bag counts written in a blue spiral notebook. Federal Exhibit Number 17. It appeared in a footnote to the Criminal Complaints Factual Basis section. 9 years on a mail route, a notebook, and a question nobody had thought to ask about who was eating all that food. The 3 individuals arrested on January 22nd entered federal custody and remained held without bond. Their initial appearances were brief. The weight of the charges, particularly the weapons counts, where mandatory minimums created a prosecutorial floor that gave defendants very little negotiating room, meant that the early court proceedings were largely procedural. Defense counsel in each case filed standard motions. The cases moved into the pre-trial process. The 12 young women recovered from the sealed rear room were connected with HSI victim services within hours of the raid. Federal victim advocates remained in contact through the weeks that followed. Their identities were not disclosed in any public court document. Their names were sealed at the request of prosecutors, granted by the magistrate, on the grounds that disclosure could compromise both their safety and the ongoing investigation. What the public record does show is this: all 12 were accounted for. All 12 received continued medical and support services coordinated through federal channels. The case file notes in a single line of the victim summary section that each had been reported missing by family members or contacts during a window between late October and mid-November 2025. The reports came from 4 different states. None of the missing persons reports had, prior to the January 22nd raid, been connected to each other or to the Meridianville address. 4 states, 12 young women, 41 days, and not a single data point that would have linked them in any database until the thermal imaging analyst wrote the phrase, consistent with multiple individuals in a confined space. The Meridianville cul-de-sac returned to quiet within 48 hours. The federal vehicles cleared. The perimeter tape came down. The boat on the trailer sat in the driveway while the house was processed by the evidence response team. The neighbors went back to their routines. The streetlight still flickered at the same interval. The 2 individuals named in the superseding indictment, who were not in custody, remained at large as of the most recent available court filing. The $400,000 in untraced outbound transfers remained unrecovered. The machining equipment used to produce the auto-sear conversions had been identified but not yet seized, pending coordination with law enforcement in a second state. The 3 individuals taken into custody on January 22nd were awaiting trial. The mail carrier returned to her route the following Monday. She has not been publicly identified. She will not be. That is the arrangement she requested, and federal prosecutors honored it. Her notebook is a federal exhibit. Her name is a blank in the public record. Somewhere in a second state, the machining equipment that produced 8 converted rifles was still in place as of the last available filing date. Somewhere outside the United States, or inside it under a different name, one of the 2 unindicted architects of the Grainger County network remained unlocated. The house at the end of the cul-de-sac is still standing. The "Beware of Dog" sign is still on the gate. Nobody has moved the boat. The network that used that house as a node operated for at least 14 months before the ram hit the door. The postal inspector's cross-reference took 6 weeks. The investigation after the cross-reference took 53 days. 41 of those days were the days the rear room was occupied. Federal task forces do not move faster than their slowest input. In this case, the slowest input was a handwritten log that sat on a postmaster's desk for 4 days before anyone knew what to do with it. The question that remains open in the case record is not whether the 3 in custody will be convicted. The weight of the evidence suggests that is a settled matter. The open question, the one that the superseding indictment, the untraced transfers, and the 2 names without addresses all point toward, is whether the network itself has been dismantled, or only its most visible room. The demand that sustained 14 months of operation in northern Alabama and northeastern Tennessee did not disappear on January 22, 2026. It was present the day before the raid. It was present the day after. The house is quiet now. That is not the same thing as the network being